So it wasn't a restart. It didn't. I mean, it did a restart. It wasn't. No, I. Yeah. Never mind. We can talk about that later. So, where was I before computer said, "Screw you, cat"? Oh, I'm stretching. Okay. Brush guy has redeemed the stretch, so let's stretch. Let's stretch. So we were at supple. Oh, see, then it's perfect. Windows 11 is coming. A whole new look, more apps, plus a whole new bunch of pain in the ass shit. It's not here yet. It's only a matter of time. Let's just stretch a bit. We'll just. Oh, stretch arms. A tactical stretch. Yes, brush guy. It's perfect. This is what we needed. This is what we needed. It is annoying. Yeah, it is already annoying as hell. Well done, Microsoft. Yeah, I don't know what it is about me streaming and when my computer decides to do that. Ah, stretch. Will we do the behind the head stretch? Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, you can feel that. Oh, you're hitting all of them. Hey, brush guy. Some water. Also, I have ginger tea. Just taking care. I appreciate it. All right. We were just at an action moment, too. What a time. What a time to go dark, right? Just as he grabs this guy's neck and his gun arm and forces him to the ground and drops the pistol. Well, let's see what happened. The weapon dropped from his grasp, and my fingers choked off his attempted cry for assistance. Excuse me. It was the perfect cliffhanger. Literally on the edge of the roof, 1,000 feet up. I gagged and bound him and then hung him over the edge of the roof as I myself had hung a few moments before. I knew it would be morning before he would be discovered, and I needed all the time that I could gain. I don't understand why he killed those 4 guards outright, and he didn't just kill this one. Excuse me while I enjoy my burp. Did I? It's ice cream. Oh well, you know. Now you all know. Right? What's not to enjoy? Yeah, so why didn't he just kill this guy instead of hanging him off the edge and worrying about, when the guy would be discovered? Fangwad says he's not a random murderer. He did try to talk his way past the 4 before they attacked him. Well, that's true, Fangwad. That's true. Trash Panda, how are you? Sibstorm says JJ is a mod here. Shocker. Yeah, he's a mod everywhere. I felt like I kind of just had to, you know. Yeah, at this point I kind of just had to. Right? Right, JJ? It's more fun sometimes to just incapacitate someone. That's so true. Trouble, you make a good point. Yeah, it's tradition. It's tradition. I needed all the time that I could gain. Donning my trappings and weapons, I hastened to the shed and soon had out both my machine and Kanto's cans. Making his fast behind mine, I started my engine, and skimming over the edge of the roof, I dove down into the streets of the city far below the plain usually occupied by the air patrol. In less than a minute, I was settling safely upon the roof of our apartment beside the astonished Kanto's can. I lost no time in explanation, but plunged immediately into a discussion of our plans for the immediate future. It was decided that I was to try to make helium, while Kantos Kan was to enter the palace and dispatch Sabthan. If successful, he was then to follow me. He set my compass for me, a clever little device which will remain steadfastly fixed upon any given point on the surface of Barsoom, and, bidding each other farewell, we rose together and sped in the direction of the palace, which lay in the route which I must take to reach Helium. Sibstrom says it's interesting that with all of his mod powers, he could single-handedly bring down the Twitch mini painting community. Oh, I don't know. Yes, yes, it's your power. Hey, Misko. It's reading day, Misko. As we neared the high tower, a patrol shot down from above, throwing its piercing searchlight full upon my craft, and a voice roared out to command a halt, following with a shot as I paid no attention to his hail. Kantos Kan dropped quickly into the darkness, while I rose steadily and at terrific speed raced through the Martian sky, followed by a dozen of the air scout craft, which had joined the pursuit, and later by a swift cruiser carrying 100 men and a battery of rapid-fire guns. By twisting and turning my little machine, now rising and now falling, I managed to elude their searchlights most of the time, but I was also losing ground by these tactics, and so I decided to hazard everything on a straightaway course and leave the result to fate and the speed of my machine. I find it interesting that this was originally written in 1914. If you can imagine these flying machines that the author is envisioning here, which is pretty amazing. Brush Guy. Yes, Brush Guy. JJ could do a 1-year timeout for everyone. JJ says, oh my, I must only use these powers for good and innuendo, never for evil or actual work. Hey, Nixel. You want pictures or a diorama? Can you act it out for me? Are you speaking to me or to JJ? Brush Guy says, as always, sci-fi is far ahead of its time. Is there a coloring page? I wish there was a coloring page. Wouldn't that be fun? The John Carter of Mars coloring book? Please act it out. No. No, there's a reason I'm not an actor, even though I took acting classes when I was younger. It's because I'm terrible at it. Where was I? Ah, the rapid-fire guns. By twisting and turning my little machine, now rising up and now rising up and now falling. I managed to elude their searchlights most of the time, but I was also losing ground by these tactics, and so I decided to hazard everything on a straightaway course and leave the result to fate and to the speed of my machine. Kantos Kan had shown me a trick of gearing, which is known only to the Navy of Helium, that greatly increased the speed of our machines, so that I felt sure I could distance my pursuers if I could dodge their projectiles for a few moments. As I sped through the air, the screeching of the bullets around me convinced me that only by a miracle could I escape, but the die was cast, and throwing on full speed, I raced a straight course toward Helium. Gradually I left my pursuers further and further behind, and I was just congratulating myself on my lucky escape when a well-directed shot from the cruiser exploded at the prow of my little craft. The concussion nearly capsized her, and with a sickening plunge, she hurtled downward through the dark night. JJ would like me to especially act out the parts about the throbbing muscles and heaving bosoms. There really haven't been much of those in this book, JJ, but you know I always will heave the bosom. Will always heave the bosom. How far I fell before I regained control of the plane I do not know, but I must have been very close to the ground when I started to rise again, as I plainly heard the squealing of animals below me. Rising again, I scanned the heavens for my pursuers, and finally making out their lights far behind me, saw that they were landing, evidently in search of me. Not until their lights were no longer discernible did I venture to flash my little lamp upon my compass, and then I found to my consternation that a fragment of the projectile had utterly destroyed my only guide as well as my speedometer. It was true I could follow the stars in the general direction of Helium, but without knowing the exact location of the city or the speed at which I was traveling, my chances for finding it were slim. Yes, JJ, I am heaving my bosom only for you. Spit, spit, the speedometer. Spid, that's what we call it here. The speedometer. The speedometer. I like spitometer though. Measures the level of spit. Never mind. Helium lies 1,000 miles southwest of Zodanga, and with my compass intact I should have made the trip, barring accidents, in between 4 and 5 hours. As it turned out, however, morning found me speeding over a vast expanse of dead sea bottom, after nearly 6 hours of continuous flight at high speed. Presently a great city showed below me, but it was not Helium, as that alone of all Barsoomian metropolises consists in two immense circular walled cities about 75 miles apart, and would have been easily distinguishable from the altitude at which I was flying. Thank you, JJ. Oh yeah, that was V's dog. That's a true story. My roommate in college did call me Heartless Wench. And when I went back to Minnesota, she's one of the people I visited. She's one of the people I visited. Tea. Must have tea. Believing that I had come too far to the north and west, I turned back in a southeasterly direction, passing during the forenoon several other large cities, but none resembling the description which Kantos Kan had given me of Helium. Did he not think to land and ask for directions? Like, there's a huge city, and it's clearly not of Zondangan alliance. So why not stop and ask? Believing I had come too far north and west, I turned back. I already read that. Several other large cities, but none resembling the description which Kantos Kan had given me of Helium. In addition to the twin city formation of Helium, another distinguishing feature is the two immense towers, one of vivid scarlet, rising nearly a mile into the air from the center of one of the cities, while the other of bright yellow and of the same height marks her sister. Fangwad says he's a man's man. Asking for directions means you're not a man. Also, they are probably dead cities, not red Martian cities. They're dead, not red. Okay, that's probably true. Means they're probably populated by green Martians. Chapter 24. Tars Tarkus finds a friend. I feel like this could be a kid's book. Tars Tarkus finds a friend. Can you imagine the illustrations? Brush Guy says, but asking for directions also means you will learn the direction. See, that is true. About noon, I passed low over a great dead city of ancient Mars, and I skimmed out across the plain beyond. I came full upon several thousand green warriors engaged in a terrific battle. Scarcely had I seen them than a volley of shots was directed at me, and with the almost unfailing accuracy of their aim, my little craft was instantly a ruined wreck, sinking erratically to the ground. Wow. Did he roll a 1 on perception or what? I fell almost directly in the center of the fierce combat among warriors who had not seen my approach, so busily were they engaged in life and death struggles. The men were fighting on foot with long swords, while an occasional shot from a sharpshooter on the outskirts of the conflict would bring down a warrior who might for an instant separate himself from the entangled mass. As my machine sank among them, I realized that it was fight or die, with good chances of dying in any event, and so I struck the ground with drawn longsword, ready to defend myself as I could. I fell beside a huge monster who was engaged with three antagonists, and as I glanced at his fierce face, filled with the light of battle, I recognized Tars Tarkas of Thark. He did not see me, as I was a trifle behind him, and just then the three warriors opposing him, and whom I recognized as Warhoons, charged simultaneously. The mighty fellow made quick work of one of them, but in stepping back for another thrust, he fell over a dead body behind him, and was down and at the mercy of his foes in an instant. Quick as lightning they were upon him, and Tars Tarkas would have been gathered to his fathers in short order, had I not sprung before his prostrate form and engaged his adversaries. I had accounted for one of them when the mighty Thark regained his feet and quickly settled the other. He gave me one look, and a slight smile touched his grim lip, as, touching my shoulder, he said, I would scarcely recognize you, John Carter, but there is no other mortal upon Barsoom who would have done what you have for me. I think I have learned that there is such a thing as friendship, my friend. Oh, if that's not the stuff of kids' books, I don't know what is. That's the sweetest part of this entire book. Yeah, 0 on perception. Yeah. Fangwood says, this is exactly why you don't approach cities to ask for directions. Yes, this could happen to any one of us. Anytime we stop and ask a stranger for directions. Brush Guy says, I have no pride, so I don't care. That is a good way to live your life, right there. Tars Tarkus found a friend. I know, V. It's so sweet it makes me want to cry. He said no more, nor was there opportunity, for the war hoons were closing in about us, and together we fought, shoulder to shoulder, during all that long, hot afternoon, until the tide of battle turned, and the remnant of the fierce war hoon horde fell back upon their throats, and fled into the gathering darkness. 10,000 men had been engaged in that titanic struggle, and upon the field of battle lay 3,000 dead. Neither side asked or gave quarter, nor did they attempt to take prisoners. On our return to the city after the battle, we had gone directly to Tars Tarkas' quarters, where I was left alone while the chieftain attended the customary council, which immediately follows an engagement. As I sat awaiting the return of the green warrior, I heard something move in an adjoining apartment, and as I glanced up, there rushed suddenly upon me a huge and hideous creature, which bore me backwards upon the pile of silks and furs upon which I had been reclining. We know who it is. It was Woola! Faithful, loving Woola! He had found his way back to Thark, and as Tars Tarkas later told me, had gone immediately to my former quarters, where he had taken up his pathetic and seemingly hopeless watch for my return. Okay, second most heartwarming part of this whole book. Woola finds John Carter again. Tal Hodges knows that you are here, John Carter, said Tars Tarkas on his return from the Jedak's quarters. Sarkoja saw and recognized you as we were returning. Tal Hodges has ordered me to bring you before him tonight. I have 10 thoats, John Carter. You may take your choice from among them, and I will accompany you to the nearest waterway that leads to Helium. Tars Tarkas may be a cruel green warrior, but he can be a friend as well. Come, we must start. And when you return, Tars Tarkas? I asked. The wild Kalats, possibly, or worse, he replied, unless I should chance to have the opportunity I have so long waited of battling with Tal Hodges. We will stay, Tars Tarkas, and see Tal Hodges tonight. You shall not sacrifice yourself, and it may be that tonight you can have the chance you wait. He objected strenuously, saying that Tal Hodges often flew into wild fits of passion at the mere thought of the blow I had dealt him, and that if ever he laid his hands upon me I would be subjected to the most horrible tortures. While we were eating, I repeated to Tars Tarkas the story which Sola had told me that night upon the sea bottom during the march to Thark. This entire chapter is just full of sweet things. You all remember what Sola told him on that march to Thark, right? She, of all the green Martians, knows who her parents are. Because normally they don't. And Tars Tarkas is her father, and he doesn't know it. It's so sweet. So John Carter has just told him that Sola is his daughter. He said but little, but the great muscles of his face worked in passion and in agony at recollection of the horrors which had been heaped upon the only thing he had ever loved in all his cold, cruel, terrible existence. He no longer demurred when I suggested that we go before Tal Hodges, only saying that he would like to speak to Sarkoja first. At his request, I accompanied him to her quarters, and the look of venomous hatred she cast upon me was almost adequate recompense for any future misfortunes this accidental return to Thark might bring me. Sarkoja, said Tars Tarkas, 40 years ago you were instrumental in bringing about the torture and death of a woman named Gozava. I have just discovered that the warrior who loved that woman has learned of your part in the transaction. He may not kill you, Sarkoja, it is not our custom, but there is nothing to prevent him tying one end of a strap about your neck and the other end to a wild thoat, merely to test your fitness to survive and help perpetuate our race. Having heard that he would do this on the morrow, I thought it only right to warn you, for I am a just man. The river Is but a short pilgrimage, Sarkoja. Come, John Carter. Oh, ho, ho, ho. Oh. Hey, Sidwee. Welcome. So, he basically just told Sarkoja she should take the river Is to her death, which of course is, you go there, you never return. Nobody knows what happens because you're going to join your ancestors. We can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. Exactly, Fanglod. The next morning, Sarkoja was gone, nor was she ever seen after. In silence we hastened to the Jedak's palace, where we were immediately admitted to his presence. In fact, he could scarcely wait to see me, and was standing erect upon his platform, glowering at the entrance as I came in. "Strap him to that pillar," he shrieked. "We shall see who it is who dares strike the mighty Tal Hadjas. Heat the irons. With my own hands I shall burn the eyes from his head, that he may not pollute my person with his vile gaze." "Chieftains of Thark," I cried, turning to the assembled council and ignoring Tal Hadjas, "I have been a chief among you, and today I have fought for Thark shoulder to shoulder with her greatest warrior. You owe me at least a hearing. I have won that much today. You claim to be just people." "Silence!" roared Tal Hadjas. "Gag the creature and bind him as I command." "Justice, Tal Hadjas!" exclaimed Lorquas Tomo. "Who are you to set aside the customs of ages among the Tharks?" "Yes, justice!" echoed a dozen voices. And so, while Tal Hadjas fumed and frothed, I continued. "You are a brave people, and you love bravery. But where was your mighty Jedak during the fighting today? I did not see him in the thick of battle. He was not there. He rends defenseless women and little children in his lair. But how recently has one of you seen him fight with men? Why, even I, a midget beside him, felled him with a single blow of my fist. Is it of such that the Tharks fashion their Jedaks? There stands beside me now a great Thark, a mighty warrior and a noble man. Chieftains, how sounds Tars Tarkas, Jedak of Thark?" A roar of deep-toned applause greeted this suggestion. "It but remains for this council to command, and Tal Hadjas must prove his fitness to rule. Were he a brave man, he would invite Tars Tarkas to combat, for he does not love him, but Tal Hadjas is afraid. Tal Hadjas, your Jedak, is a coward. With my bare hands I could kill him, and he knows it." After I ceased, there was tense silence, and all eyes were riveted upon Tal Hadjas. He did not speak or move, but the blotchy green of his countenance turned livid, and the froth froze upon his lips. "Tal Hadjas," said Lorquas Tomal, in a cold, hard voice, "never in my long life have I seen a Jedak of the Tharks so humiliated. There could be but one answer to this arraignment. We waited." And still Tal Hadjas stood as though electrified. "Chieftains," continued Lorquas Tomal, "shall the Jedak Tal Hadjas prove his fitness to rule over Tars Tarkas?" There were 20 chieftains about the rostrum, and 20 swords flashed high in assent. There was no alternative. That decree was final, and so Tal Hodges drew his long sword and advanced to meet Tars Tarkas. The combat was soon over, and with his foot upon the neck of the dead monster, Tars Tarkas became Jeddak among the Tharks. His first act was to make me a full-fledged chieftain with the rank I had won by my combats the first few weeks of my captivity among them. Seeing the favorable disposition of the warriors towards Tars Tarkas as well as toward me, I grasped the opportunity to enlist them in my cause against Zodanga. I told Tars Tarkas the story of my adventures, and in a few words had explained to him the thought I had in mind. "John Carter has made a proposal," he said, addressing the council, "which meets with my sanction. I shall put it to you briefly. Dejah Thoris, the Princess of Helium, who was our prisoner, is now held by the Jeddak of Zodanga, whose son she must wed to save her country from devastation at the hands of the Zodangan forces. John Carter suggests that we rescue her and return her to Helium. The loot of Zodanga would be magnificent, and I have often thought that, had we an alliance with the people of Helium, we could obtain sufficient assurance of sustenance to permit us to increase the size and frequency of our hatchings, and thus become unquestionably supreme among the green men of all Barsoom. What say you?" It was a chance to fight, an opportunity to loot, and they rose to the bait as a speckled trout to the fly. For Tharks, they were wildly enthusiastic, and before another half hour had passed, 20 mounted messengers were speeding across Dead Sea bottoms to call the hordes together for the expedition. In 3 days we were on the march towards Zodanga, 100,000 strong, as Tars Tarkas had been able to enlist the services of 3 smaller hordes on the promise of the great loot of Zodanga. At the head of the column I rode beside the great Thark, while at the heels of my mount trotted my beloved Woola. We traveled entirely by night, timing our marches so that we camped during the day at deserted cities, where even to the beasts we were all kept indoors during the daylight hours. On the march, Tars Tarkas, through his remarkable ability and statesmanship, enlisted 50,000 more warriors from various hordes, so that 10 days after we set out, we halted at midnight outside the great walled city of Zodanga, 150,000 strong. The fighting strength and efficiency of this horde of ferocious green monsters was equivalent to 10 times their number of red men. Never in the history of Barsoom, Tars Tarkas told me, had such a force of green warriors marched to battle together. It was a monstrous task to keep even a semblance of harmony among them, and it was a marvel to me that he got them to the city without mighty battle among themselves. But as we neared Zodanga, their personal quarrels were submerged by their greater hatred for the red men, and especially for the Zodangans, who had for years waged a ruthless campaign of extermination against the green men, directing special attention toward despoiling their incubators. Now that we were before Zodanga, the task of obtaining entry to the city devolved upon me, and directing Tars Tarkas to hold his forces in 2 divisions out of earshot of the city, with each division opposite a large gateway. I took 20 dismounted warriors and approached one of the small gates that pierced the walls at short intervals. These gates have no regular guard, but are covered by sentries who patrol the avenue that encircles the city just within the walls, as our metropolitan police patrol their beats. The walls of Zodanga are 75 feet in height and 50 feet thick. They are built of enormous blocks of carborundum, and the task of entering the city seemed to my escort of green warriors an impossibility. The fellows who had been detailed to accompany me were of one of the smaller hordes, and therefore did not know me. Placing 3 of them with their faces to the wall and arms locked, I commanded 2 more to mount to their shoulders, and a 6th I ordered to climb upon the shoulders of the upper 2. The head of the topmost warrior towered over 40 feet from the ground. In this way, with 10 warriors, I built a series of 3 steps from the ground to the shoulders of the topmost man. Then, starting from a short distance behind them, I ran swiftly up from one tier to the next, and with a final bound from the broad shoulders of the highest, I clutched the top of the great wall and quietly drew myself to its broad expanse. After me I dragged 6 lengths of leather from an equal number of my warriors. These lengths we had previously fastened together, and passing one end to the topmost warrior, I lowered the other end cautiously over the opposite side of the wall toward the avenue below. No one was in sight, so lowering myself to the end of my leather strap, I dropped the remaining 30 feet to the pavement below. I had learned from Kantos Kan the secret of opening these gates, and in another moment my 20 great fighting men stood within the doomed city of Zodanga. I found to my delight that I had entered at the lower boundary of the enormous palace grounds. The building itself showed in the distance a blaze of glorious light, and on the instant I determined to lead a detachment of warriors directly within the palace itself, while the balance of the great horde was attacking the barracks of the soldiery. Dispatching one of my men to Tars Tarkas for a detail of 50 Tharks, with word of my intentions, I ordered 10 warriors to capture and open one of the great gates, while the 9 remaining I took to the other. We were to do our work quietly, no shots were to be fired, and no general advance made until I had reached the palace with my 50 Tharks. Our plans worked to perfection. The 2 sentries we met were dispatched to their fathers upon the banks of the lost Sea of Chorus, and the guards at both gates followed them in silence. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. The Looting of Zodanga. As the great gate where I stood swung open, my 50 Tharks, headed by Tars Tarkas himself, rode upon their mighty thoats. I led them to the palace walls, which I negotiated easily without assistance. Once inside, however, the gate gave me considerable trouble, but I finally was rewarded by seeing it swing upon its huge hinges, and soon my fierce escort was riding across the gardens of the Jeddak of Zodanga. As we approached the palace, I could see through the great windows of the first floor into the brilliantly illuminated audience chamber of Than Kosis. There you go, Miss Go. As we approached the palace, I could see through the great windows of the first floor into the brilliantly illuminated audience chamber of Than Kosis. The immense hall was crowded with nobles and their women, as though some important function was in progress. There was not a guard in sight without the palace, due, I presumed, to the fact that the city and the palace walls were considered impregnable, and so I came close and peered within. At one end of the chamber, upon massive golden thrones, encrusted with diamonds, sat Than Kosis and his consort, surrounded by officers and dignitaries of state. Before them stretched a broad aisle, lined on either side with soldiery. And as I looked, there entered this aisle at the far end of the hall the head of a procession, which advanced to the foot of the throne. First there marched 4 officers of the Jeddak's guard, bearing a huge salver on which reposed, upon a cushion of scarlet silk, a great golden chain with a collar and padlock at each end. Directly behind these officers came 4 others, carrying a similar salver, which supported the magnificent ornaments of a prince and princess of the reigning house of Zodanga. Guess what's happening, people? He better bring his Tharks in there right now. That's all I have to say. At the foot of the throne, these 2 parties separated and halted, facing each other at opposite sides of the aisle. Then came more dignitaries, and the officers of the palace and of the army, and finally 2 figures, entirely muffled in scarlet silk, so that not a feature of either was discernible. These 2 stopped at the foot of the throne, facing Than Kosis. When the balance of the procession had entered and assumed their stations, Than Kosis addressed the couple standing before him. I could not hear his words, but presently 2 officers advanced and removed the scarlet robe from one of the figures, and I saw that Kantos Kan had failed in his mission, for it was Sab Than, Prince of Zondanga, who stood revealed before me. Does he not know this is a wedding? How does he not know that this is the wedding? Thancosus now took a set of the ornaments from one of the salvers and placed one of the collars of gold about his son's neck, springing the padlock fast. After a few more words addressed to Sabthan, he turned to the other figure, from which the officers now removed the enshrouding silks, disclosing to my now comprehending view Dejah Thoris, Princess of his now comprehending view. John Carter, I'm sorry. I thought you were smarter than this. The object of the ceremony was clear to me. In another moment Dejah Thoris would be adjoined forever to the Prince of Zodanga. How about we charge in now? Maybe make a distraction with killing. It was an impressive and beautiful ceremony, I presume, but to me it seemed the most fiendish sight I had ever witnessed, and as the ornaments were adjusted upon her beautiful figure, and her collar of gold swung open in the hands of Thancosus, I raised my long sword above my head, and with the heavy hilt I shattered the glass of the great window, and sprang into the midst of the astonished assemblage. With a bound I was on the steps of the platform beside Thancosus, and as he stood riveted with surprise, I brought my long sword down upon the golden chain that would have bound Dejah Thoris to another. In an instant all was confusion. 1,000 drawn swords menaced me from every quarter, and Sabthan sprang upon me with a jeweled dagger he had drawn from his nuptial ornaments. I could have killed him as easily as I might a fly, but the age-old custom of Barzoom stayed my hand. And grasping his wrist, as the dagger flew toward my heart, I held him as though in a vice, and with my long sword pointed to the far end of the hall. Zodanga has fallen, I cried. Look! All eyes turned in the direction I had indicated, and there, forging through the portals of the entrance-way, rode Tars Tarkas and his 50 warriors on their great thoats. A cry of alarm and amazement broke from the assemblage, but no word of fear. And in a moment the soldiers and nobles of Zodanga were hurling themselves upon the advancing Tharks. Thrusting Sabthan headlong from the platform, I drew Dejah Thoris to my side. Behind the throne was a narrow doorway, and in this Thancosus now stood facing me, with drawn longsword. In an instant we were engaged, and I found no mean antagonist. As we circled upon the broad platform, I saw Sabthan rushing up the steps to aid his father, but as he raised his hand to strike, Dejah Thoris sprang before him, and then my sword found the spot that made Sabthan Jeddak of Zodanga. As his father rolled dead upon the floor, the new Jeddak tore himself free from Dejah Thoris's grasp, and again we faced each other. He was soon joined by a quartet of officers, and with my back against a golden throne, I fought once again for Dejah Thoris. I was hard pressed to defend myself, and yet not strike down Sabthan, and with him my last chance to win the woman I loved. My blade was swinging with the rapidity of lightning as I sought to parry the thrusts and cuts of my opponents. 2 I had disarmed, and 1 was down, when several more rushed to the aid of their new ruler, and to avenge the death of the old. As they advanced, there were cries of, "The woman! The woman! Strike her down! It is her plot! Kill her! Kill her!" Calling to Dejah Thoris to get behind me, I worked my way toward the little doorway back of the throne, but the officers realized my intentions, and 3 of them sprang in behind me and blocked my chances for gaining a position where I could have defended Dejah Thoris against any army of swordsmen. Cannot he just jump out of the fray, like, further, for a better position? Hey, Jarrett. All their fault. I mean, he could do like Conan and grab and jump. I mean, she's just a little thing. She weighs practically nothing. He can just grab her and jump. If it was Conan, that's what he would do. Just saying. The Tharks were having their hands full in the center of the room, and I began to realize that nothing short of a miracle could save Dejah Thoris and myself when I saw Tars Tarkas surging through the crowd of pygmies that swarmed about him. With one swing of his mighty longsword he laid a dozen corpses at his feet, and so he hewed a pathway before him until in another moment he stood upon the platform beside me, dealing death and destruction right and left. The bravery of the Zodangans was awe-inspiring. Not one attempted to escape, and when the fighting ceased it was because only Tharks remained alive in the great hall other than Dejah Thoris and myself. Sabthan lay dead beside his father, and the corpses of the flower of Zodangan nobility and chivalry covered the floor of the bloody shambles. My first thought, when the battle was over, was for Kantos Kan, and leaving Dejah Thoris in charge of Tars Tarkas, I took a dozen warriors and hastened to the dungeons beneath the palace. The jailers had all left to join the fighters in the throne room, so we searched the labyrinthine prison without opposition. I called Kantos Kan's name aloud in each new corridor and compartment, and finally I was rewarded by hearing a faint response. Guided by the sound, we soon found him helpless in a dark recess. He was overjoyed in seeing me and to know the meaning of the fight, faint echoes of which had reached his prison cell. He told me that the air patrol had captured him before he reached the high tower of the palace, so that he had not even seen Sabthan. We discovered that it would be futile to attempt to cut away the bars and chains which held him prisoner, so at his suggestion I returned to search the bodies on the floors above for keys to open the padlocks of his cell and his chains. Fortunately, among the first I examined, I found his jailer, and soon we had Kantos Kan with us in the throne room. Ha ha, Feignwood, nothing but a miracle could save me. Tars Tarkas says, you called? I heard you wanted a miracle. Here I am. I lost my place. The sound of heavy firing, mingled with shouts and cries, came to us from the city's streets, and Tars Tarkas hastened away to direct the fighting without. Kantos Kan accompanied him to act as guide, the green warriors commencing a thorough search of the palace for other Zodangan and for loot, and Dejah Thoris and I were left alone. She had sunk into one of the golden thrones, and as I turned to her she greeted me with a wan smile. "Was there ever such a man?" she exclaimed. "I know that Barzoom has never before seen your like. Can it be that all Earthmen are as you? Alone, a stranger, hunted, threatened, persecuted." This seems like part of a line from like a movie ad. Alone, a stranger, hunted, threatened, persecuted. John Carter. You have done, in a few short months, what in all the past ages of Barsoom no man has ever done, joined together the wild hordes of the sea bottoms and brought them to fight as allies of a red Martian people. The answer is easy, Dejah Thoris, I replied, smiling. It was not I who did it, it was love. Love for Dejah Thoris, a power that would work greater miracles than this you have seen. A pretty flush overspread her face, and she answered, "You may say that now, John Carter, and I may listen, for I am free." "And more still I have to say ere it is again too late," I returned. "I have done many strange things in my life, many things that wiser men would not have dared, but never in my wildest fancies have I dreamed of winning a Dejah Thoris for myself. For never had I dreamed that in all the universe dwelt such a woman as the Princess of Helium. That you are a princess does not abash me, that you are but that you are you is enough to make me doubt my sanity as I ask you, my princess, to be mine." "He does not need to be abashed, who so well knew the answer to his plea before the plea were made," she replied. "Why are they suddenly speaking in Old English?" He does not need to be abashed who so well knew the answer to his plea before the plea were made, she replied, rising and placing her dear hands upon my shoulders, and so I took her in my arms and kissed her. And thus, in the midst of a city of wild conflict, filled with the alarms of war, with death and destruction reaping their terrible harvest around her, did Dejathoris, Princess of Helium, true daughter of Mars, the god of war, promise herself in marriage to John Carter, gentleman of Virginia. It's not the end. That's just the end of chapter 25. See, now we have chapter 26. It's not the end. Chapter 26. Through carnage to joy. You will miss the end, but you have to go play with the puppy. See, we're just going to finish. We're just going to finish this book. How many channel points to get you to act it out? There's not enough channel points that any of you has for that. Sometime later, Taras Tarkas and Kantos Kan returned to report that Zodanga had been completely reduced. Her forces were entirely destroyed or captured, and no further resistance was to be expected from within. Several battleships had escaped, but there were thousands of war and merchant vessels under guard of Thark warriors. The lesser hordes had commenced looting and quarreling among themselves, so it was decided that we collect what warriors we could, man as many vessels as possible with Zodangan prisoners, and make for Helium without further loss of time. 5 hours later, we sailed from the roofs of the dock buildings with a fleet of 250 battleships carrying nearly 100,000 green warriors, followed by a fleet of transports with our thoats. Behind us, we left the stricken city in the fierce and brutal clutches of some 40,000 green warriors of the lesser hordes. They were looting, murdering, and fighting amongst themselves. In 100 places they had applied the torch, and columns of dense smoke were rising above the city, as though to blot out the eye of heaven the horrid sights beneath. In the middle of the afternoon we sighted the scarlet and yellow towers of Helium, and a short time later a great fleet of Zodangan battleships rose from the camps of the besiegers without the city, and advanced to meet us. The banners of Helium had been strung from stem to stern of each of our mighty craft, but the Zodangans did not need this sign to realize that we were enemies, for our green Martian warriors had opened fire upon them almost as they left the ground. With their uncanny marksmanship, they raked the oncoming fleet with volley after volley. The twin cities of Helium, perceiving that we were friends, sent out hundreds of vessels to aid us, and then began the first real air battle I had ever witnessed. The vessels carrying out our green warriors were kept circling above the contending fleets of Helium and Zodanga, since their batteries were useless in the hands of the Tharks, who, having no navy, have no skill in naval gunnery. Their small arm fire, however, was most effective, and the final outcome of the engagement was strongly influenced, if not wholly determined, by their presence. At first the two forces circled at the same altitude, pouring broadside after broadside into each other. Presently a great hole was torn in the hull of one of the immense battle craft from the Zodangan camp. With a lurch she turned completely over, the little figures of her crew plunging, turning, and twisting toward the ground 1,000 feet below. Then with sickening velocity she tore after them, almost completely burying herself in the soft loam of the ancient sea bottom. A wild cry of exultation arose from the Heliumite squadron, and with redoubled ferocity they fell upon the Zodangan fleet. By a pretty maneuver, two of the vessels of Helium gained a position above their adversaries, from which they poured upon them from their keel bomb batteries, a perfect torrent of exploding bombs. Then one by one the battleships of Helium succeeded in rising above the Zidongan, and in a short time a number of the beleaguering battleships were drifting hopeless wrecks toward the high scarlet tower of Greater Helium. Several others attempted to escape, but they were soon surrounded by thousands of tiny individual flyers, and above each hung a monster battleship of Helium, ready to drop boarding parties upon their decks. Within but little more than an hour from the moment the victorious Zidongan squadron had risen to meet us from the camp of the besiegers, the battle was over, and the remaining vessels of the conquered Zidongans were heading toward the cities of Helium under prize crews. There was an extremely pathetic side to the surrender of these mighty flyers, the result of an age-old custom which demanded that surrender should be signalized by the voluntary plunging to earth of the commander of the vanquished vessel. One after another, the brave fellows, holding their colors high above their heads, leaped from the towering bows of their mighty craft to an awful death. Not until the commander of the entire fleet took the fearful plunge, thus indicating the surrender of the remaining vessels, did the fighting cease, and the useless sacrifice of brave men come to an end. We now signaled the flagship of Helium's navy to approach, and when she was within hailing distance, I called out that we had the Princess Dejah Thoris on board, and that we wished to transfer her to the flagship that she might be taken immediately to the city. As the full import of my announcement bore in upon them, a great cry rose from the decks of the flagship, and a moment later the colors of the Princess of Helium broke from 100 points upon her upper works. When the other vessels of the squadron caught the meaning of the signals flashed them, they took up the wild acclaim and unfurled her colors in the gleaming sunlight. The flagship bore down upon us, and as she swung gracefully to and touched our side, a dozen officers sprang upon our decks. As their astonished gaze fell upon the hundreds of green warriors who now came forth from the fighting shelters, they stopped aghast, but at sight of Kantos Kan, who advanced to meet them, they came forward crowding about him. Dejah Thoris and I then advanced, and they had no eyes for other than her. She received them gracefully, calling each by name, for they were men high in the esteem and service of her grandfather, and she knew them well. "Lay your hands upon the shoulder of John Carter," she said to them, turning toward me, "the man to whom Helium owes her princess as well as her victory today." They were very courteous to me and said many kind and complimentary things, but what seemed to impress them most was that I had won the aid of the fierce Tharks in my campaign for the liberation of Dejah Thoris and the relief of Helium. "You owe your thanks more to another man than to me," I said, "and here he is. Meet one of Barsoom's greatest soldiers and statesmen, Tars Tarkas, Jeddak of Thark." With the same polished courtesy that had marked their manner toward me, they extended their greetings to the great Thark, nor, to my surprise, was he much behind them in ease of bearing or in courtly speech. Though not a garrulous race, the Tharks are extremely formal, and their ways lend themselves amazingly well to dignified and courtly manners. Dejah Thoris went aboard the flagship, and was much put out that I would not follow, but as I explained to her, the battle was but partly won. We still had the land forces of the besieging Zidongans to account for, and I would not leave Tars Tarkas until that had been accomplished. The commander of the naval forces of Helium promised to arrange to have the armies of Helium attack from the city in conjunction with our land attack, and so the vessels separated, and Dejah Thoris was borne in triumph back to the court of her grandfather, Tardos Mor's Jeddak of Helium. In the distance lay our fleet of transports, with the thoats of the green warriors, where they had remained during the battle. Without landing stages, it was to be a difficult matter to unload these beasts upon the open plain, but there was nothing else for it, and so we put out for a point about 10 miles from the city and began the task. It was necessary to lower the animals to the ground in slings, and this work occupied the remainder of the day and half the night. Twice we were attacked by parties of Zidongan cavalry, but with little loss, however, and after darkness shut down they withdrew. As soon as the last thoat was unloaded, Tars Tarkas gave the command to advance, and in 3 parties we crept upon the Zidongan camp from the north, the south, and the east. About a mile from the main camp we encountered their outposts, and, as had been prearranged, accepted this as the signal to charge. With wild, ferocious cries, and amidst the nasty squealing of battle-enraged thoats, we bore down upon the Zodongans. We did not catch them napping, but found a well-entrenched battle line confronting us. Time after time we were repulsed, until, toward noon, I began to fear for the result of the battle. The Zodongans numbered nearly 1,000,000 fighting men, gathered from pole to pole wherever stretched their ribbon-like waterways, while pitted against them were less than 100,000 green warriors. The forces from Helium had not arrived, nor could we receive any word from them. Just at noon we heard heavy firing all along the line between the Zodongans and the cities, and we knew then that our much-needed reinforcements had come. Again Tarkis ordered the charge, and once more the mighty thoats bore their terrible riders against the ramparts of the enemy. At the same moment the battle line of Helium surged over the opposite breastworks of the Zodongans, and in another moment they were being crushed as between two millstones. Nobly they fought, but in vain. The plain before the city became a veritable shambles ere the last Zodongan surrendered. But finally the carnage ceased. The prisoners were marched back to Helium, and we entered the greater city's gates, a huge triumphal procession of conquering heroes. The broad avenues were lined with women and children, among which were the few men whose duties necessitated that they remain within the city during the battle. We were greeted with an endless round of applause, and showered with ornaments of gold, platinum, silver, and precious jewels. The city had gone mad with joy. My fierce Tharks caused the wildest excitement and enthusiasm. Never before had an armed body of green warriors entered the gates of Helium, and that they came now as friends and allies filled the red men with rejoicing. That my poor services to Dejah Thoris had become known to the Heliumites was evidenced by the loud crying of my name, and by the loads of ornaments that were fastened upon me and my huge thoat as we passed up the avenue to the palace. For even in the face of the ferocious appearance of Woola, the populace pressed close about me. As we approached this magnificent pile, we were met by a party of officers who greeted us warmly and requested that Tarkis and his Jeds, with the Jedaks and Jeds of his wild allies, together with myself, dismount and accompany them to receive from Tardos Mors an expression of his gratitude for our services. At the top of the great steps leading up to the main portals of the palace stood the royal party, and as we reached the lower steps, one of their number descended to meet us. He was an almost perfect specimen of manhood, tall, straight as an arrow, superbly muscled, and with the carriage and bearing of a ruler of men. I did not need to be told that he was Tardos Mors, Jedak of Helium. The first member of our party he met was Tarkis, and his first words sealed forever the new friendship between the races. "That Tardos Mors," he said earnestly, "may meet the greatest living warrior of Barsoom is a priceless honor, but that he may lay his hand on the shoulder of a friend and ally is a far greater boon." "Jedak of Helium," returned Tarkis, "it has remained for a man of another world to teach the green warriors of Barsoom the meaning of friendship. To him we owe the fact that the hordes of Thark can understand you, that they can appreciate and reciprocate the sentiments so graciously expressed." Tardos Mors then greeted each of the green Jedaks and Jeds, and to each spoke words of friendship and appreciation. As he approached me, he laid both hands upon my shoulders. "Welcome, my son," he said. "That you are granted gladly, and without one word of opposition. The most precious jewel in all Helium, yes, on all Barsoom, is sufficient earnest of my esteem." We were then presented to Mors Kajak, Jed of Lesser Helium, and father of Dejah Thoris. He had followed close behind Tardos Mors, and seemed even more affected by the meeting than had his father. He tried a dozen times to express his gratitude to me, but his voice choked with emotion, and he could not speak. And yet he had, as I was to later learn, a reputation for ferocity and fearlessness as a fighter that was remarkable even upon warlike Barsoom. In common with all Helium, he worshipped his daughter, nor could he think of what she had escaped without deep emotion. It's not the end. There's more. Chapter 27. We thought it was the end, but no. No, there's more. From joy to death. Brushcase says, but my end. No, there's got to be only one chapter left. It's one more chapter. No, you're collapsing. It's fine. It's fine. I will allow that it's late there. You have to go to sleep. From joy to death. For 10 days the hordes of Thark and their wild allies were feasted and entertained, and then, loaded with costly presents and escorted by 10,000 soldiers of Helium, commanded by Morz Kajak, they started on the return journey to their own lands. The Jed of Lesser Helium with a small party of nobles accompanied them all the way to Thark to cement more closely the new bonds of peace and friendship. Sola also accompanied Tars Tarkas, her father, who before all his chieftains had acknowledged her as his daughter. 3 weeks later, Morz Kajak and his officers, accompanied by Tars Tarkas and Sola, returned upon a battleship that had been dispatched to Thark to fetch them in time for the ceremony which made Dejah Thoris and John Carter one. For 9 years they served in the councils and fought in the armies of Helium as a prince of the house of Tardos Mors. The people seemed never to tire of heaping honors upon me, and no day passed that did not bring some new proof of their love for my princess, the incomparable Dejah Thoris. In a golden incubator upon the roof of our palace lay a snow-white egg. For nearly 5 years 10 soldiers of the Jedak's guard had constantly stood over it, and not a day passed when I was in the city that Dejah Thoris and I did not stand hand in hand before our little shrine, planning for the future when the delicate shell should break. Vivid in my memory is the picture of the last night as we sat there talking in low tones of the strange romance which had woven our lives together, and of this wonder which was coming to augment our happiness and fulfill our hopes. In the distance we saw the bright white light of an approaching airship, but we attached no special significance to so common a sight. Like a bolt of lightning it raced toward Helium until its very speed bespoke the unusual. Flashing the signals which proclaimed it a dispatch bearer for the Jedak, it circled impatiently, awaiting the tardy patrol boat which must convey it to the palace docks. 10 minutes after it touched at the palace, a message called me to the council chamber, which I found filling with the members of that body. On the raised platform of the throne was Tardos Mors, pacing back and forth with a tense, drawn face. When all were in their seats, he turned toward us. This morning, he said, word reached the several governments of Barsoom that the keeper of the atmosphere plant had made no wireless report for 2 days, nor had almost ceaseless calls upon him from a score of capitals elicited a sign of response. The ambassadors of the other nations asked us to take the matter in hand and hasten the assistant keeper to the plant. All day 1,000 cruisers have been searching for him until just now one of them returns bearing his dead body, which was found in the pits beneath his house, horribly mutilated by some assassin. I do not need to tell you what this means to Barsoom. It would take months to penetrate those mighty walls. In fact, the work has already commenced, and there would be little to fear were the engine of the pumping plant to run as it should, and as they all have for hundreds of years now. But the worst, we fear, has happened. The instruments show a rapidly decreasing air pressure on all parts of Barsoom. The engine has stopped. My gentlemen, he concluded, we have at best 3 days to live. There was absolute silence for several minutes, and then a young noble arose, and with his drawn sword held high above his head addressed Tardos Mors. The men of Helium have prided themselves that they have ever shown Barsoom how a nation of red men should live. Now it is our opportunity to show them how they should die. Let us go about our duties as though 1,000 useful years still lay before us." The chamber rang with applause, and as there was nothing better to do than to allay the fears of the people by our example, we went our ways with smiles upon our faces and sorrow gnawing at our hearts. When I returned to my palace, I found that the rumor already had reached Dejathoris, so I told her all that I had heard. "We have been very happy, John Carter," she said, "and I think whatever fate overtakes us, that it permits us to die together." The next 2 days brought no noticeable change in the supply of air, but on the morning of the third day breathing became difficult at the higher altitudes of the rooftops. The avenues and plazas of Helium were filled with people. All businesses had ceased. For the most part the people looked bravely into the face of their unalterable doom. Here and there, however, men and women gave way to quiet grief. Toward the middle of the day many of the weaker commenced to succumb, and within an hour the people of Barsoom were sinking by thousands into the unconsciousness which precedes death by asphyxiation. Dejathoris and I, with the other members of the royal family, had collected in a sunken garden within an inner courtyard of the palace. We conversed in low tones, when we conversed at all, as the awe of the grim shadow of death crept over us. Even Woola seemed to feel the weight of the impending calamity, for he pressed close to Dejathoris and to me, whining pitifully. The little incubator had been brought from the roof of our palace at request of Dejathoris, and now she sat gazing longingly upon the unknown little life that now she would never know. As it was becoming perceptibly difficult to breathe, Tardos Mors arose, saying, "Let us bid each other farewell. The days of the greatness of Barsoom are over. Tomorrow's sun will look down upon a dead world, which through all eternity must go swinging through the heavens, peopled not even by memories. It is the end." He stooped and kissed the women of his family, and laid his strong hand upon the shoulders of the men. As I turned sadly from him, my eyes fell upon Dejathoris. Her head was drooping upon her breast. To all appearances she was lifeless. With a cry I sprang to her and raised her into my arms. Her eyes opened and looked into mine. "Kiss me, John Carter," she murmured. "I love you. I love you. It is cruel that we must be torn apart, who are just starting upon a life of love and happiness." As I pressed her dear lips to mine, the old feeling of unconquerable power and authority rose in me. The fighting blood of Virginia sprang to life in my veins. "It shall not be, my princess," I cried. There must be some way, and John Carter, who has fought his way through a strange world for love of you, will find it." And with my words there crept above the threshold of my conscious mind a series of 9 long-forgotten sounds. Like a flash of lightning in the darkness, their full purport dawned upon me. The key to the 3 great doors of the atmosphere plant. Did he forget that he was ever there? Turning suddenly toward Tardos Mors, as I still clasped my dying love to my breast, I cried, "A flyer, Jeddak, quick! Order your swiftest flyer to the palace top. I can save Barsoom yet." He did not wait to question, but in an instant a guard was racing to the nearest dock, and though the air was thin and almost gone at the rooftop, they managed to launch the fastest one-man air scout machine that the skill of Barsoom had ever produced. Kissing Dejathoris a dozen times and commanding Woola, who would have followed me, to remain and guard her, I bounded with my old agility and strength to the high ramparts of the palace, and in another moment I was headed toward the goal of the hopes of all Barsoom. I had to fly low to get sufficient air to breathe, but I took a straight course across an old sea bottom, and so had to rise only a few feet above the ground. I traveled with awful velocity, for my errand was a race against time with death. The face of Dejathoris hung always before me. As I turned for a last look as I left the palace garden, I had seen her stagger and sink upon the ground beside the little incubator. that she had dropped into the last coma which would end in death if the air supply remained unreplenished, I well knew, and so, throwing caution to the winds, I flung overboard everything but the engine and compass, even to my ornaments, and lying on my belly along the deck with one hand on the steering wheel and the other pushing the speed lever to its last notch, I split the thin air of dying Mars with the speed of a meteor. An hour before dark, the great walls of the atmosphere plant loomed suddenly before me, and with a sickening thud I plunged to the ground before the small door which was withholding the spark of life from the inhabitants of an entire planet. Beside the door, a great crew of men had been laboring to pierce the wall, but they had scarcely scratched the flint-like surface, and now most of them lay in their last sleep, from which not even air would awaken them. Conditions seemed much worse here than at Helium, and it was with difficulty that I breathed at all. There were a few men still conscious, and one of these I spoke. "If I can open these doors, is there a man who can start the engines?" I asked. "I can," he replied, "if you open quickly. I can last but a few moments more. But it is useless. They are both dead, and no one else upon Barsoom knew the secret of these awful locks. For 3 days men crazed with fear have surged about this portal in vain attempts to solve its mystery." I had no time to talk. I was becoming very weak, and it was with difficulty that I controlled my mind at all. But with a final effort, as I sank weakly to my knees, I hurled the 9 thought waves at that awful thing before me. The Martian had crawled to my side, and with staring eyes fixed on the single panel before us, we waited in the silence of death. Slowly, the mighty door receded before us. I attempted to rise and follow it, but I was too weak. "After it," I cried to my companion, "and if you reach the pump room, turn loose all the pumps. It is the only chance Barsoom has to exist tomorrow." From where I lay I opened the second door, and then the third, and as I saw the hope of Barsoom crawling weakly on hands and knees through the last doorway, I sank unconscious upon the ground. Oh my goodness. There's another chapter. I thought that was the last one. I was sure of it. Okay. Chapter 29, at the Arizona Cave. This has to be the end. He's in Arizona again, at the Arizona Cave. Ah, then I have to hydrate. I got it. I got it. It was dark when I opened my eyes again. Strange, stiff garments were upon my body, garments that cracked and powdered away from me as I rose to a sitting posture. I felt myself over from head to foot, and from head to foot I was clothed, though when I fell unconscious at the little doorway I had been naked. Before me was a small patch of moonlit sky which showed through a ragged aperture. As my hands passed over my body they came in contact with pockets, and in one of these a small parcel of matches wrapped in oiled paper. One of these matches I struck, and its dim flame lighted up what appeared to be a huge cave, toward the back of which I discovered a strange, still figure huddled over a tiny bench. As I approached it, I saw that it was the dead and mummified remains of a little old woman with long black hair, and the thing it leaned over was a small charcoal burner upon which rested a round copper vessel containing a small quantity of greenish powder. Behind her, depending from the roof upon rawhide thongs and stretching entirely across the cave, was a row of human skeletons. From the thong which held them stretched another From the thong which held them stretched another to the dead hand of the little old woman. As I touched the cord the skeletons swung to the motion with a noise as of rustling of dry leaves. It was a most grotesque and horrid tableau, and I hastened out into the fresh air, glad to escape from so gruesome a place. The sight that met my eyes as I stepped out upon a small ledge which ran before the entrance of the cave filled me with consternation. A new heaven and a new landscape met my gaze. The silvered mountains in the distance, the almost stationary moon hanging in the sky, the cacti-studded valley below me were not of Mars. I could scarcely believe my eyes, but the truth slowly forced itself upon me. I was looking upon Arizona from the same ledge from which 10 years before I had gazed with longing upon Mars. Burying my head in my arms, I turned, broken and sorrowful, down the trail from the cave. Above me shone the red eye of Mars holding her awful secret, 48 million miles away. Did the Martian reach the pump room? Did the vitalizing air reach the people of that distant planet in time to save them? Was my Dejah Thoris alive, or did her beautiful body lie cold in death beside the tiny golden incubator in the sunken garden of the inner courtyard of the palace of Tardos Mors, the Jeddak of Helium? For 10 years I have waited and prayed for an answer to my questions. For 10 years I have waited and prayed to be taken back to the world of my lost love. I would rather lie dead beside her there than live on earth all those millions of terrible miles from her. The old mine, which I found untouched, has made me fabulously wealthy, but what care I for wealth? As I sit here tonight in my little study overlooking the Hudson, just 20 years have elapsed since I first opened my eyes upon Mars. I can see her shining in the sky through the little window by my desk, and tonight she seems calling to me again as she has not called before since that long dead night, and I think I can see, across that awful abyss of space, a beautiful black-haired woman standing in the garden of a palace, and at her side is a little boy who puts his arms around her as she points into the sky toward the planet Earth, while at their feet is a huge and hideous creature with a heart of gold. I believe that they are waiting there for me, and something tells me that I shall soon know. That's the end. That's the end of A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Next week, book 2. Next week, who knows? Who knows what we'll be reading next week? Yet to be determined. I probably should plan ahead so that I can, plug whatever I'm reading the next week, but that just doesn't seem like me. That's entirely too organized. Fangwad says, fortunately, just like in Star Trek, biology doesn't matter and any two races can make babies together despite the improbability. Yeah. If only there was something John Carter could do about this. It was a fairly unremarkable encounter by John Carter's standards, and it was 10 years ago. That's true. That's true. It was not 10 years ago for us, so we remember it much better. Yeah, that's why the Apaches were scared of that cave. So that's the end of the chapter. That's the end of the stream. We will rate someone. Who shall we raid? It's Friday night. We have not rated Captain Madlove in a super long time. Super long time. So we will raid her. What's she doing? Super chibi weekend. And it's Friday, so it's date night probably. And I will be doing the podcast on Sunday night at 6:30 Central Time, which we do every Sunday night. And then I will be back to streaming mini painting again on Tuesday, 3 p.m. Central as usual. So I will see you all then. Have a great weekend. And say hey to Captain Madlove. Leave a little hello in her chat. Give her a follow. And with that, I will say goodbye.